The early hours of dawn on June 25, 1950, marked a turning point in world history that would echo for decades. On that silent morning, when the world was still waking up to another seemingly ordinary Sunday, the forces of the Korean People's Army crossed an imaginary line that divided not only a peninsula, but two antagonistic worldviews. The 38th parallel ceased to be a mere geographic coordinate and became the epicenter of a confrontation that would define the course of the Cold War and establish fundamental precedents for all conflicts that followed. The Korean Peninsula, after decades under Japanese rule, emerged from the end of World War II as a territory fragmented between the victorious great powers. The division established by the Allies in August 1945 reflected much more than temporary administrative considerations. It represented the physical materialization of the ideological tensions that were already beginning to define the new world order. North of the 38th parallel, Soviet forces established their zone of influence under the aegis of Marxism-Leninism, while to the south, American troops implemented political and economic structures aligned with Western capitalist principles. This geographic partition created distinct social laboratories, where each superpower could experiment with and demonstrate the superiority of its respective systems. The United States-Soviet Joint Commission, initially conceived to administer the Korean transition toward independence, quickly became a stage for irreconcilable disputes. Fundamental differences over the methods for conducting elections, the nature of the institutions to be established, and the criteria for unification proved to be unbridgeable gaps. The events of 1946 and 1947 demonstrated that cooperation between the superpowers was a diplomatic illusion that crumbled before the reality of conflicting geopolitical interests. Popular demonstrations against foreign trusteeship were suppressed with military force, showing that stability on the peninsula would depend not on the Korean will, but on the balance of power between Washington and Moscow. The American proposal for UN-supervised elections met with systematic resistance from the Soviets and the Korean Communists, who perceived the initiative as an attempt at international legitimation of a process biased in favor of Western interests. This rejection catalyzed the holding of separate elections in 1948, definitively consolidating the peninsula's division. The Republic of Korea, proclaimed on August 15, 1948, under the leadership of Syngman Rhee, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, established on September 9th of the same year with Kim Il-sung at the helm, emerged as rival states claiming legitimacy over the entire Korean territory. Each of these regimes represented not only the extension of the influence of their respective sponsoring powers, but also the concrete realization of incompatible civilizational projects. The withdrawal of American and Soviet troops from the peninsula in 1948 and 1949 created an apparent power vacuum that masked intense military preparation on both sides. Military advisors remained, transferring technical and strategic knowledge that would transform the Korean forces into modern and lethal armies. Mao Zedong's China, newly victorious in its own civil war, watched developments on the peninsula with growing interest, recognizing that Korea's fate would directly influence its own national security and its positioning in the Asian geopolitical chess game. The Chinese Communist triumph fundamentally altered the strategic calculations of all parties involved, creating the possibility of a Sino-Korean alliance that could challenge American hegemony in the Pacific. Military preparations in the north of the peninsula assumed impressive proportions during the months preceding June 1950. The Korean People's Army, forged in Soviet discipline and strengthened by thousands of veterans from the Chinese Civil War, reached an operational strength of approximately 180,000 men, organized into 10 infantry divisions, 1 armored division, and 1 Air Force division. The North Korean arsenal included 210 combat aircraft and 280 tanks, in addition to substantial reserves that ensured logistical sustenance for prolonged operations. In dramatic contrast, the Republic of Korea Army had only 98,000 soldiers, 65,000 of whom were in combat roles, with no tanks and a symbolic air force of 22 aircraft. This disparity was not accidental. It reflected deliberate strategies of preparation for a confrontation that both Korean leaders considered inevitable. Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee shared a common ambition for territorial unification, but radically diverged on the methods and final objectives. Both pressured their international allies for support for military campaigns that promised to definitively resolve the Korean question. The initial Soviet and American reluctance to support military ventures that could precipitate a world war reflected the superpowers' caution regarding the global implications of a regional conflict. However, the dynamics of border skirmishes, guerrilla operations in the south, and diplomatic incidents created a spiral of tensions that made maintaining the status quo increasingly difficult. Statistics reveal the intensity of this undeclared war. Up to 8,000 members of the South Korean security forces lost their lives in clashes with communist guerrillas between 1948 and 1950, while the institutional construction process of the new state was systematically sabotaged. The international context of June 1950 presented unique characteristics that would decisively influence the unfolding of events in Korea. The consolidation of communist power in China had altered the regional balance of forces, creating the possibility of an arc of Soviet influence extending from Vladivostok to Guangzhou. The Soviet Union, still recovering from the devastating human and material costs of World War II, sought to expand its sphere of influence without provoking direct confrontation with the United States. Moscow's strategy banked on the thesis that Washington, traumatized by the costs of the recently concluded World War and reluctant to get involved in Asian conflicts after the Chinese experience, would not intervene militarily to save the Syngman Rhee regime. This perception, though understandable given the historical precedents, underestimated the American determination to contain communist expansion and the symbolism that Korea would assume in the global narrative of the Cold War. When the first salvos of North Korean artillery echoed across the 38th parallel in the early hours of June 25th, they announced not only the beginning of a Korean civil war, but the opening of a new chapter in the confrontation between West and East. The conflict that was beginning would quickly transcend the peninsula's borders to become a laboratory where the superpowers would test their military capabilities, political strategies, and ideological determination. The Korean War would establish fundamental precedents for conducting limited conflicts in the context of the nuclear age, demonstrate the limits and possibilities of proxy war, and define patterns of international involvement that would influence everything from Vietnam to Afghanistan. The initial North Korean offensive proved to be a masterful demonstration of military planning and tactical execution that surprised international observers with its efficiency and coordination. The Korean People's Army First Corps, with 53,000 men, advanced across the Imjin River towards Seoul, while the Second Corps, with 54,000 soldiers, conducted simultaneous attacks along two widely separated axes, one through the cities of Chuncheon and Hongcheon, the other along the eastern coastal road toward Gangneung. This multi-front strategy aimed to fragment the South Korean defenses and prevent the concentration of forces for a coordinated resistance. The North Korean material superiority in tanks and heavy artillery became evident in the first hours of combat, when South Korean forces, lacking adequate anti-tank weaponry, saw their defensive positions systematically destroyed by Soviet T-34-85 armor operated by experienced crews. The fall of Seoul on June 28th, just 3 days after the start of hostilities, symbolized the catastrophic collapse of South Korean defenses and exposed the fragility of the nation-building project sponsored by the United States. The South Korean capital, the political and economic center of the country, fell not only due to North Korean military superiority, but also as a consequence of the fragmentation and demoralization of the defending forces. The Syngman Rhee government, facing the imminent collapse of its authority, ordered massacres of alleged communist sympathizers that would continue throughout the summer of 1950 and result in the deaths of approximately 200,000 civilians. These atrocities revealed the fragile and authoritarian nature of the South Korean regime, contradicting the Western narrative that presented it as a defender of democracy against communist totalitarianism. News of the North Korean invasion reached Washington at a time when the Truman administration was fundamentally redefining its global strategy of containment against communism. The Truman Doctrine, formulated 3 years earlier in the context of the Greek and Turkish crisis, now faced its first definitive test in a geographic theater that many considered peripheral to vital American interests. The Korean Peninsula was not among the immediate strategic priorities of the United States. Secretary of State Dean Acheson had explicitly excluded Korea from the American defensive perimeter in the Pacific during a speech given in January 1950. This declaration, widely interpreted as a green light for communist military ventures, demonstrated the complexity of geopolitical calculations in an era of limited resources and multiple global threats. Initial American reluctance to intervene directly in Korea reflected deep practical and strategic considerations that transcended the immediate situation of the peninsula. The possibility of direct confrontation with the Soviet Union and Communist China carried the potential to precipitate a Third World War at a time when the wounds of the Second had not yet fully healed. Washington strategists understood that Korea could turn into a trap that would drain American resources needed for the defense of Western Europe, considered the main theater of confrontation with communism. Furthermore, the recent experience of the Chinese Civil War, where American support for Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had proven insufficient to prevent the communist victory, created discouraging precedents regarding the effectiveness of Western intervention in Asian conflicts. However, the lightning triumph of Kim Il-sung's forces dramatically altered American strategic perceptions about the global implications of the Korean crisis. The speed and efficiency of the North Korean offensive demonstrated communist military capabilities that surprised Western analysts and raised worrying questions about the possibility of similar operations at other vulnerable points along the American defensive perimeter. The prospect of a unified Korea under communist control represented a direct threat to Japan, considered the cornerstone of American strategy in the Pacific and a fundamental element in containing Soviet and Chinese expansion in the region. American military planners recognized that the loss of Korea would create a forward communist base just a few kilometers from the Japanese islands, irreversibly compromising the archipelago's defense capability and permanently altering the regional balance of power. The psychological dimension of the Korean crisis assumed paramount importance in Washington's deliberations, where policymakers understood that the American response would be interpreted by allies and adversaries as an indicator of Western determination to resist communist expansion. The domino theory, though not yet formalized with this term, was already influencing American strategic thinking, suggesting that inaction in Korea could encourage similar communist ventures in Indochina, Europe, and other contested regions. The credibility of American leadership in the free world depended on demonstrating that the United States would not abandon democratic allies in the face of communist aggression, even when these allies were located in geographically distant theaters from traditional Western centers of power. The unanimous approval of the United Nations Security Council resolution condemning North Korean aggression and authorizing the use of force to restore peace on the peninsula provided the international legitimacy the Truman administration needed to justify military intervention. The absence of the Soviet Union from the Security Council, a result of its boycott in protest against the refusal to recognize the People's Republic of China, created a unique window of opportunity to obtain an international mandate for Western military action. This fortuitous coincidence allowed the American intervention to take on the characteristics of a multilateral operation under the auspices of the United Nations, conferring legal and moral legitimacy that would be fundamental to maintaining domestic and international support for the war effort. President Harry Truman, a political veteran known for his determination in moments of crisis, made the decision to intervene militarily in Korea after intensive consultations with his main national security advisors. Congress's authorization of $12 billion for military action in Korea, approved in August 1950, demonstrated substantial bipartisan support for the policy of active containment of communism. This astronomical figure for the time reflected the recognition that the Korean War represented much more than a regional conflict. It constituted a fundamental investment in the credibility of American deterrence and in maintaining the international order established after 1945. The first American units transferred from Japan to Korea faced the monumental challenge of confronting veteran and well-equipped North Korean forces with limited resources and inadequate preparation for the specific conditions of the Korean theater. Task Force Smith, composed of 540 men from the 24th Infantry Regiment, represented the baptism by fire for American forces in the Korean War during the Battle of Osan on July 5, 1950. This small detachment, facing elements of the North Korean 4th Infantry Division, supported by 33 T-34 tanks, managed to resist for 3 hours before being forced to retreat in the face of a massive enemy attack. The American casualties, 60 killed and 82 captured, announced the start of a conflict that would severely test the military capability and political determination of the United States. The initial experience of American forces in Korea revealed serious deficiencies in Western equipment, training, and military doctrine for facing adversaries equipped with modern Soviet weaponry and tactics adapted to Asian conditions. The North Korean T-34-85 tanks proved superior to the American M24 Chaffee armor in terms of armor, firepower, and mobility, while the Communist artillery demonstrated precision and coordination that surprised Western commanders. These revelations forced a fundamental re-evaluation of American military capabilities and accelerated modernization programs that would influence the entire structure of Western forces during the following decade. Chinese involvement in the Korean War, initially through the sending of military advisors and supplies, gradually evolved into direct participation that would completely alter the nature and scale of the conflict. Mao Zedong's China, consolidating its power after decades of civil war and Japanese invasion, saw the Korean crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate its emergence as a regional power and establish revolutionary credentials in the communist world. The geographical proximity between China and Korea created national security imperatives that transcended ideological considerations. A unified Korea under American influence would represent a direct threat to the Chinese industrial provinces in Manchuria and establish a forward base for possible invasion of Chinese territory. Soviet pressure on China to provide military support to North Korea skillfully exploited the Chinese need for economic and technological assistance for post-Civil War reconstruction. Moscow offered Beijing access to advanced military technology, industrial expertise, and financial resources in exchange for Chinese involvement in the Korean conflict, creating a dynamic of dependence that served Soviet geopolitical interests in the region. This Sino-Soviet partnership, though based more on pragmatic calculations than genuine ideological solidarity, would create a formidable alliance that would challenge Western hegemony in Asia for decades. Guerrilla warfare in South Korea, conducted by communist sympathizers even before the start of conventional hostilities, had created an environment of instability and terror that facilitated the initial North Korean advance. These irregular operations, responsible for the deaths of 8,000 members of the South Korean security forces between 1948 and 1950, demonstrated the depth of communist infiltration in the South and the effectiveness of revolutionary warfare tactics developed during the anti-Japanese struggle. The Korean experience anticipated conflict patterns that would be repeated in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and other Cold War theaters, establishing precedents for the importance of the political and psychological dimension in modern warfare. The overwhelming military superiority demonstrated by North Korean forces during the first months of the conflict revealed not only disparities in equipment and training, but also fundamental differences in the strategic and doctrinal conceptions guiding the opposing armies. The Korean People's Army, forged according to Soviet principles of mechanized warfare and strengthened by the practical experience of thousands of veterans from the Chinese Civil War, operated with a cohesion and determination that contrasted dramatically with the fragmentation and demoralization of South Korean forces. The T-34-85 tanks, armor that had participated in the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, dominated the Korean battlefields against defenders lacking effective anti-tank weaponry, creating a dynamic of tactical superiority that translated into spectacular territorial advances. The multi-front strategy adopted by the North Korean command masterfully exploited the structural limitations of the South Korean defenses, forcing the dispersal of already scarce resources along an extensive and porous front line. The Korean People's Army First Corps, advancing through the strategic corridor leading directly to Seoul, concentrated masses of infantry and armor that systematically overwhelmed the South Korean defensive positions established along the Imjin and Han rivers. Simultaneously, the Second Corps executed pincer movements that threatened to completely envelop the enemy forces, creating a desperate tactical situation that prevented any attempt at coordinated defensive reorganization. The fall of Seoul on June 28th represented much more than the capture of a national capital. It symbolized the complete collapse of the state-building project sponsored by the United States on the peninsula and exposed the inherent fragilities of client regimes established during the early years of the Cold War. The city, the nerve center of South Korean political, economic, and cultural life, was abandoned by a panicked government that left behind not only vital government facilities, but also military equipment, strategic supplies, and, most tragically, hundreds of thousands of defenseless civilians. The chaotic evacuation of Seoul, accompanied by the destruction of bridges over the Han River, while thousands of refugees were still trying to escape, created scenes of horror that would remain etched in the Korean collective memory for generations. The Syngman-rhee regime, facing the imminent disintegration of its authority and legitimacy, responded to the military crisis with a brutality that revealed its authoritarian nature and the superficiality of its democratic community.